Hey everybody tuning in online. Today we're going to be talking about Flutter for Desktop, but just to remind everybody here real quick, we are using the microphones in the ceiling and they can pick up pretty much everything, so don't say anything you wouldn't want heard online and try and avoid making a whole bunch of weird sounds during the presentation. I'll hear it in the recording. My name is Emmett Dean. I am the engineering manager of the Flutter team at Black Airplane. I have a background in native Android and iOS development, and I've now been using Flutter for a little over 3 years. And I've published over 12 different Flutter apps, and we have several more in progress, both personal projects like my startup, and then other projects here at Black Airplane. I want to give a quick shout out to Black Airplane. Thank you for letting us use this awesome venue and the food and the beer. We have a pretty special team here that produces top quality work, and we're capable of producing pretty much anything these days. So we have web development teams, both front end, back end, our mobile app team, and we love building really crazy, unique software here. Like I said, today we're going to be talking about desktop development with Flutter. And real quick, let's just go over what this means. So Flutter supported Windows back in Flutter 2.1. That's when it officially came out of beta and went stable. And just recently, when Flutter 3 came out, they have now stable support for macOS and Linux, even though both of these have been in beta for quite some time. So here's just a brief look at the full supported platforms list. There's a more in-depth version of this on Flutter's website that also talks about Google-tested platforms and stuff like this. But this is their official supported platforms, which is really exciting as a Flutter developer. Every time a new platform gets added, it just kind of expands our capabilities on what we're able to build and where we're able to deploy that without having to learn too much new technology. So really awesome from the Flutter team, and it's going to be awesome to see what people build with this. So first, is Flutter good for desktop? This is pretty much what the talk is going to be about today, and the best way I have of discussing this is comparing it to a pretty popular application out there so far, which is Electron. Electron is a JavaScript framework that is super popular for developing desktop applications, and it's behind a lot of ones that you probably use, like VS Code, Figma, Slack, Discord, and many others. And so for this comparison, we're going to be using a lot of information from a company called Gitstream, and I've linked their blog post if you want to see all of their graphs and everything more in depth than what I'm going to describe here. Gitstream is very cool. I've used some of their services before. They offer like drop-in chat systems and everything for Flutter, so it takes a lot of load off of you if you want to just implement things like chat in your application. So you should definitely check them out and see if there's anything that could be useful for you there. So first, let's talk about the current state of Electron and Flutter for Desktop. So Electron has stood the test of time clearly and has been proven to be a good tool to bring web apps to desktop. They have many examples of large name companies that are using Electron like we just talked about, and they've proven you can successfully build high-end desktop applications with it. So Flutter for Desktop application is very new, and we don't have very many big names to give it credibility yet. But the initial performance seems to be extremely promising for Flutter. And in theory, if an app built with Flutter runs really well on mobile, it should run just the same, if not even better, on desktop due to better hardware. So first, let's talk about how these actually run. So Electron is going to use the JavaScript V8 engine, and the V8 engine is Google's open source, high-performance JavaScript and WebAssembly engine written in C++, and it is used in Chrome and Node.js, among other popular frameworks. V8 compiles and executes JavaScript source code, handles memory allocation for objects, and garbage collects objects it no longer needs. V8's stop-the-world generational accurate garbage collector is one of the keys to V8's performance. Flutter uses Dart native, which during development has a fast developer cycle and is critical for iteration. The Dart VM offers a just-in-time compiler with incremental recompilation, enabling hot reload, which is one of Flutter's favorite features. Live metric collections through the dev tools, and rich debugging support. When apps are ready to be deployed to production, whether you're publishing to an app store or deploying to a production backend, the Dart AOT compiler enables ahead-of-time compilation to native ARM or x64 machine code. Your AOT compiled app launches with consistent short startup time. The AOT compiled code runs inside an efficient Dart runtime that enforces the sound Dart type system and manages memory using fast object allocation and a generational garbage collector. The key takeaway from this is that Dart can give you a fast developer experience with hot reload and a small compiled application size when creating release builds. So let's dig into application size, dependencies, and modules. With Electron, the executable size for a simple Hello World app is going to be about 150 megabytes or more. The reason for this is that it runs on a Chromium browser, which means every app is bundled with its own browser. So it has to bundle an entire browser into the application when it ships, which really inflates the application size. You also need to be more mindful of modules included. If you're an experienced JavaScript developer, you've probably already experienced this, and this may not be a big deal for you, but for other developers learning to use Electron, this could be. With Flutter, the executable size of a Hello World app is much closer to 30 megabytes. And Dart is much better at stripping away unneeded code and dependencies, making it so that you have to worry about less. There's also less configuration to get started. In fact, if you create a new Flutter app with Flutter Create, you're probably going to already have the folders ready to go for a Windows, Mac OS, or Linux app. And if not, you can just run Flutter Create in an existing project and it'll add those folders for you. So let's look at isolates, web workers, and processes. In Electron, it must spin up some extra processes by default because it's running on Chromium. So you'll see it's actually, by default, will spin up 4 different processes, one for GPU rendering and some other helping processes. With Flutter, you're actually going to only have a single process with the option to spawn extra isolates. So you can see this keeps things a little bit lighter weight, and we'll look into actual performance numbers here in a second. So the performance test. So in the GitStream article, they went in much more depth than I'm going to here. They actually did 3 different applications, built them in both, and then compared them side by side. For these metrics, I'm only comparing the last one they did, in which GitStream actually loaded 100 high-resolution images over the network, caches them, then scales them down to a small size, and then continuously rotates the image. The reason you do tests like this is to try and stress test the application. So it's going to be something a little bit ridiculous just to try and see how can we spike CPU, GPU times, what does rendering look like. So for Electron, there was a startup time of less than 1 second, but there was noticeable frame drops for the first few seconds. The executable size ended up coming out to 183.9 megabytes, which is significantly larger than Flutter's only 27.7 megabytes. The CPU usage was a little bit higher for the Electron app, but GPU usage was fairly close. Memory, though, is where the big difference happens. You'll see the Flutter app used exactly 100 megabytes less of memory than the Electron application, which shows that Flutter could be extremely useful for making applications more performant than their Electron counterparts. The rendering time is also one of Flutter's strongest, attributes. So Electron, while it was able to render at 60 FPS with occasional frame drops like on startup, it still took 16 milliseconds to render each frame, whereas on Flutter it was able to only spend a millisecond rendering each frame, which is extremely performant and could help support even higher resolution screens. So the conclusion. Electron struggles with startup in the first contentful paint, but it is a proven working solution. So if you're asked to build a desktop application, that might be the only thing that you need to know right now. Large install size and memory usage does hurt the performance of this compared to the newer Flutter counterparts. And you also have to be more mindful of your dev process and including dependencies. Flutter, however, even though it doesn't have as many big names backing it yet, the small memory footprint and install size are extremely desirable for newly built applications. It's also easy to target multiple platforms. As you've seen, if you've built other Flutter applications, running this is going to be as simple as just selecting a different deployment target. Platform integrations are also a fantastic solution on the Flutter side, being able to talk to native code extremely easily. There are some other considerations for Flutter Desktop that we can go over briefly, which is while Flutter supports desktop, not all the packages you want to use will. For example, Firebase supports Mac OS, but not Windows and Linux yet. And this goes for a lot of different packages. So while Flutter may support these operating systems, your favorite packages that you rely on consistently may not yet. That doesn't mean they won't in the future, and that doesn't mean you can't build out your own solution for those, but there could be workarounds there, or if you have an existing app with a ton of dependencies, it's going to be a little bit harder to spin up a desktop version than you may think. Building a desktop application is also much more similar to building a web application than a mobile application. Be sure to design your application with expected navigation for desktop and keep in mind the keyboard and mouse input types compared to touch. For example, in a text input field, you can limit the keyboard type on a mobile device, but they're always going to have their full keyboard on a web or desktop application. So you need to keep that in mind when writing all of your validation and just what the user is going to expect on the other side. Compiling applications for desktop also does require compiling them, the application on the desktop running the desired operating system. So if you do intend to actually deploy this for all of these operating systems, you're going to need to have devices you can compile it with each of those operating systems. Or if you're using a CI/CD pipeline, that will complicate it because you're going to need to be able to compile it on all of those different devices. This pretty much goes over Flutter Desktop today. We wanted to give a shout out to OXOS Medical, who is hiring a Flutter lead. So if you're looking for a Flutter development job, there's a link right here that you can go and check it out. They're looking for a lead for their Flutter team, and it's under the title Full Stack Developer. Thank you guys for coming. Next time we're going to talk about integrating a third-party SDK. Before we wrap things up, does anybody have any questions?
Does it, when you're deploying desktop, and Brandon, sorry about my question earlier, to correct myself, I thought when you asked the question, I thought you said web, not desktop. Sorry about that. But when you're deploying to desktop, is there any other kind of like packages or software that the user has to download along with your software?
Yes, so let me pull it up really quick. There are a couple like toolchain items, Flutter Desktop. And it will actually show. So they break it down for you right here. So example, for Mac OS, you need Xcode and CocoaPods. Linux, you're going to need Clang, CMake. And it walks you through actually in the Flutter docs anything that you need to set up here.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Do we have any questions online, Brandon?
None that have come in. I have a beginner question.
Okay.
What is a garbage collector?
So it comes from a more low-level approach. So if you were to look at a language like C++, you have something that's provided to you called pointers. A pointer actually references a specific section of memory in a computer. With more modern languages like Java and Dart, instead of allowing pointers, they have what's called a garbage collector. With a pointer, you are responsible for clearing out that memory by yourself. With a garbage collector, as soon as there's no reference to that object in your runtime anymore, it will actually go and collect that itself. So it takes some of the load off of the developer, and the reason you do that, it also makes it a little bit safer because you can avoid what's called a memory leak. If you start allocating memory, but not cleaning it up with something like a garbage collector or manually, then you're going to end up bricking your computer. Did you get that? Mm-hmm. Randall says OXOS is hiring remote, so if any of you guys want a remote job, it is remote.
Yeah, Axos is cool. They do handheld X-ray machines. It's an X-ray gun company.
What is the link?
Let me pull it back up. Yeah, Randall also mentioned waiting for Discord and Flutter. It'd be very interesting to see a lot of the popular applications rebuilt in Flutter, whether it's Slack or even like a VS Code. You know, we live in VS Code, a lot of us as developers, so when you see the performance numbers like this and how much memory it would eat because it's an Electron app, think of how much it could save and how much more performant our day could be just because it would be rebuilt in something like this.
On that, I was just going to ask, do you prefer Visual Studio over Android Studio?
I prefer VS Code. I know a lot of tutorials and a lot of people prefer Android Studio. Android Studio just has a bad memory in the back of my head because Android Studio started as an Eclipse plugin, and that's when I used it way back in the day, and it was really, really bad back then. It's
I remember
a completely
that.
different product now. It just
Yeah.
holds a bad place in my heart.
No, thanks for that, because I'm experiencing some issues and I'm considering moving over to Visual.
Yeah, Visual Studio Code's it's very lightweight. You can customize it how you want. I know IntelliJ, a lot of our web developers use all of the IntelliJ products. So really it's what you're comfortable in and what you like to use.
Okay.
Randall also says coding in Dart is more fun than coding in TypeScript. That's another reason you should build an application with this instead of Electron.
Is there any other languages out there similar to Electron?
Electron's the only one that I know of that's at least relatively cross-platform. The biggest use case for Electron was taking a web application and making it into a desktop application. So again, JavaScript developers are some of the most popular developers in the world, so a lot of companies already had JavaScript developers that they really liked. So instead of trying to force them to learn to write some native application and duplicating code bases, this is basically just their web application wrapped in a Chromium browser and shipped in a way. That simplifies it a lot, but.
Do you guys have any clients or products using desktop yet?
We don't at Black Airplane. Desktop applications just seem to be few and far between. There's very few good reasons for us to recommend to a client why they should build a desktop app versus a web app. And also with the package support being fairly lacking, we would try and avoid building it and try and ship them with a web app first. Yeah.
What would be the difference between the web and the desktop in performance-wise? You feel like the desktop is local, that it will necessarily always have access to it versus being on the web, or which one would you say be faster or just performance-wise?
I imagine the desktop is going to be faster. Like if you experienced Slack in your browser versus Slack on your desktop, they're pretty close to the same. That's because, again, one's running in Electron. It's all JavaScript at the end of the day. Whereas Flutter, when it goes to web, it's actually compiled down to a large JavaScript bundle and then served like a single page application would be. Whereas this is going to be compiled more towards the processor that it's going to run on. So it's probably going to run better on your desktop than in a browser. Flutter for web, it's great in a lot of ways. I use it for my startup. My startup's actually 100% uses Flutter web. But there are certain things that websites need that other native platforms don't, that Flutter doesn't do well yet. A lot of it's like load times. We don't have options for server-side rendering. So whenever you load a Flutter web app, it has to load like 500 megabytes of JavaScript because it has to ship this huge JavaScript bundle. Just like if you were to build like a monolithic Angular or React app, it would be the same kind of situation.
Okay.
Neutralino, Wales, and Tori are alternatives to Electron. Ryan, I haven't heard about those before, but I'll have to check them out. So it does sound like there are some other Electron alternatives that are big out there. Yeah.
Back in the day, people used to use WX widget or Qt, and it was basically in C++, and you could write Mac and Windows and Linux, GTK.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, this is more fancy, more flamboyant.
Mm-hmm.
The GUI are more fancy.
Yeah, I mean, I've written, I've written very small C and C++ applications, but I've written some, desktop Java applications that run inside the Java runtime environment, and the control that you're going to get out of a Flutter desktop app compared to that is huge. Just how easy Flutter makes it to handle things like animations and just custom layouts, that you just get so much more control over that than you would in Java, easily at least.
Is there a good like templating layout So, I saw some stuff on their development docs, but I was just wondering if you had some insight.
Yeah, so
Boilerplates or something.
Flutter comes with a couple different design systems out of the box. So with this, they actually also released the Windows UI components out of the box that you can use if you want to make it feel like a Windows app. But notoriously, Material is probably going to be the most common one you see, which is Google's design system. And the best thing, in my opinion, that you can do when starting to build with Flutter is actually head to Material.io's design website. So you can actually go to this component library and see all of the different components. And if you click Flutter, it'll show you all the ones that are natively supported in Flutter. So if I wanted to learn, let's just click on the floating action button. It's going to talk all about the design and do's and don'ts and how you should use it in your application, which is really great for developers because most of us aren't designers. And then I believe you can also, go click on the implementation tab, choose Flutter, and it'll actually show you a code snippet on how to actually use this.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Do you see Trey's question in there?
Trey's question. For these desktop apps, is there a review process for the app similar to what you go to through on the App Store or Google Play Store? I imagine if you were to try and publish this to like the Windows Store, there would be, but this is definitely an application that you could just ship as a downloadable on your website. So you could host this as a downloadable on your website as like an executable, and they can just download it and run it that way. Now the Mac OS, they do have an App Store if you want it hosted there that you'll have to go through, I imagine, the exact same process.
Just a general question for like app development. Is there like before you put it into like a Google Play Store or Apple Store, is there like a validation process that has to go through or some kind of verification that it is? Like, I guess, testing and stuff?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of guidelines from both the Google Play and Apple App Store team that you have to abide by. As for making sure you do those things before you submit, that's going to be on like your quality assurance team or your personal quality assurance process, making sure you're doing the right thing. But then Apple does have, well, they both have review processes now, but Apple's still a little bit more in depth where they actually have a physical person open up your app. If there's a login, you have to supply them a login. You have to explain why you use certain permissions because they want to understand, especially Apple's big on privacy. They want to know, why do you need to access this location? Why do you want the heart rate data of this user? So you're going to have to explain those things.
That's what I was gonna say.
And really anything around payments, they're very sensitive on because that's how Apple makes money off of the App Store. They take a cut of any virtual good payment. Any other questions?
This has nothing to do with the desktop app, but how quickly do you think support for Flutter with the dynamic island gestures that came out yesterday, how quickly do you think that would be published or available?
Yeah, I've come to watch Apple events as where I'm almost like worried, right? I'm worried about what is the weird thing that only Apple is going to release that we're now going to get requests for here. The dynamic island I wasn't too worried about because after a closer look, it looked like the very small UI elements are probably going to automatically take icons from things that we've already implemented, like the sticky notifications and stuff like that. As for how quickly can you interact with it in Flutter, we can go ahead and write, if we knew we wanted to build something very special with the dynamic island, be the first people to it, we can write an integration to work with the native code immediately. How soon will there be a package out to make that super easy for all Flutter developers? It'll probably be a week to a month, I imagine. You have to remember with the dynamic island, they only released it on the pro version of the devices. So there's going to be very few amount of devices that come out with that immediately. So is it worth you worrying about? Probably not until more devices get it, or if you have a very specific use case for it. What I'm actually more worried about than the dynamic island was their live notifications. So if you've ever built a push notification system, we talked about it recently here, push notification systems can already get really complex. If you have a live notification like the ones that they were displaying, which seemed to be highly customizable, and also there's going to be some sort of life cycle with those interacting with your app in the back end, that seems like it's going to be a lot more complicated to implement. And also, it's only something currently supported on iPhone. So it's one of those considerations that we'll have to take if somebody wanted that, that it be only for iPhone, and you'd be building iPhone specific and that time dedication. Any other questions? I don't think we got any more online. Awesome.
Sorry, was there anything in Flutter 3.3? Did you look into those release notes? Was there anything of note?
I didn't see anything that jumped out to me. I believe they've added support for more of the new Material 3 library. I believe that's what it's called. So Material, they recently did a huge rework on their design system. I believe it's called Material 3. And you can opt into it or out of it in your Flutter app with a one-liner in the Material app. And what that's going to do is there's just new widgets that are coming out. They're really trying to make it feel more personalized, and there's more customization there. So definitely something to look into. I'm not sure if they talk about it on this. I'm sure they talk about it on their material design website. Yeah. So as you can see, like, there's support for these elements on Android phones to like take the colors of your background on your phone and stuff like this. Again, only supported on Android, not on iOS. So make considerations there, but there is full support for that in Flutter, and they're just adding more widgets to it now. Let's see, Dart 2.18 came out. Better inference and faster async under some circumstances as well. It is pretty cool in the patch notes for Flutter. If you ever wanted to contribute directly to Flutter, when the patch notes go out, it actually lists all the pull requests and who the contributors were on GitHub. So if you ever want to get recognized on Flutter's website, it's an easy way to do it. Go contribute. Cool. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and next time we will be talking about integrating a third-party SDK.